The morning sunlight spilled across the glass doors of a large department store downtown. It was one of those busy weekday afternoons when people hurried in and out, carrying bags, sipping coffee, and looking for last-minute deals. Inside, the air smelled of new clothes and fresh perfume. A woman in her mid-40s walked through the entrance quietly. She was dressed simply, jeans, a neat shirt, and a light jacket. She looked calm, collected, and tired in the way that comes after a long shift. She wasn't there to shop for anything fancy, just to pick up a few small things she needed. She moved through the aisles, checking sizes and prices, carefully comparing items before placing them in her small basket. Her movements were measured and deliberate, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But a few aisles away, a store employee watched her more closely than anyone else. The woman hadn't done anything wrong, yet something about her seemed to catch their suspicion. They whispered something to another staff member near the register, who nodded and glanced toward the woman. As the woman browsed, she could feel the stares. It wasn't the first time. She had learned to notice it without reacting. The quick glances, the quiet murmurs, the way security cameras seemed to follow her more closely than others. She took a slow breath, trying to brush off the feeling, and kept moving. She finally picked out what she needed: some toiletries, a pair of gloves, and a small gift she'd been meaning to buy for a friend. Her phone buzzed with a text, and she smiled faintly at it before heading toward the self-checkout area. She scanned each item carefully, double-checking the screen before placing them into her bag. The machine beeped oddly once, showing an error message. She tapped the help button, waiting for an attendant. The employee who came over seemed impatient. "Did you scan everything?" they asked, glancing inside her bag. "I did," she replied politely, showing the screen. It just froze for a moment. The employee sighed, typed something on the monitor, and the error cleared. The woman paid, collected her receipt, and began walking toward the exit. Behind her, the same employee frowned, whispering again to the security guard stationed near the doors. The guard watched her leave, his eyes narrowing slightly. Outside, she adjusted her bag on her shoulder, stepped into the afternoon light, and began walking toward her car. But before she could reach it, she heard a voice call out behind her. "Ma'am, could you stop for a moment?" She turned. Two uniformed officers were walking quickly in her direction. Her heart sank a little, though she didn't show it. She stood still, calm but alert. "Yes, officers?" she asked quietly. "We need to speak with you," one said, his tone sharp but not aggressive. "There's been a report of shoplifting. Could you show us your bag, please?" Her brows furrowed slightly. "Shoplifting? I just paid for my things. I have the receipt." She reached into her pocket, holding it out. The officer didn't take it immediately. "We'll take a look at that in a minute. First, please step aside." People nearby began slowing down, sensing a scene. The woman could feel eyes turning toward her. She tried to stay composed, but the sting of embarrassment cut through her calm. "Officer," she said in a steady voice, "I didn't steal anything. I paid at the self-checkout. You can check your system." But her words didn't seem to matter. One of the officers gently took her arm. "We just need to make sure, ma'am. Please cooperate." Her stomach tightened. She glanced around, realizing phones were being lifted, people recording, whispering, pointing. She could almost hear the unspoken assumptions in their looks. The second officer opened her shopping bag, pulling items out one by one. Everything had a tag removed. Each item matched the receipt in her hand. Still, the officers looked unconvinced. The first officer called the store over the radio, asking for confirmation about the supposed report. The woman waited, trying to keep her breathing even. Within a minute, the store employee came outside, looking uneasy but firm. "That's her," they said, pointing. She was acting suspicious. "I think she left without paying." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's not true," she said softly. "You helped me with the machine yourself." The employee hesitated but didn't back down. She might have scanned a few items, but not all. The officers exchanged a look. One pulled out handcuffs. "Wait," she said quickly, her tone still calm but now edged with disbelief. "You're making a mistake. Please, just check your cameras." But by now, things had already gone too far. One officer gently turned her around and began reading her rights. The other officer held her shopping bag. People stopped walking. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. She wasn't angry, just deeply, silently disappointed. They led her toward the patrol car, guiding her carefully but publicly. The phone cameras followed, recording every second of the moment. Inside the car, she sat quietly. The hum of the engine filled the air. Through the window, she could see the store worker still standing outside, arms folded, looking unsure of what they had done. One officer, sitting in the passenger seat, turned slightly toward her. "Ma'am, if there's a misunderstanding, it'll get cleared up soon," he said, his voice trying to sound gentle. She didn't answer immediately. After a moment, she spoke in a low, even tone. "It's not the misunderstanding that hurts," she said. "It's the assumption." The officer didn't respond. He stared out the windshield, suddenly uncomfortable. At the station, she was escorted inside, still calm, still dignified. They asked her to remove her belongings. She did so quietly. The officers began processing her paperwork, not yet realizing who they were dealing with. While they entered her name into the system, one of them frowned slightly at the screen. Something didn't add up. Her record was clean, spotless. No priors, no warnings, nothing but commendations attached to her name. Still, they continued the process following protocol. She was placed in a small waiting area. She sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered. She could hear the faint buzz of conversation behind the glass window, officers talking, typing, and occasionally glancing in her direction. Minutes stretched slowly. In the quiet, she thought about how ironic it all was. After decades of working in law enforcement, training younger officers about fairness, about restraint, about treating everyone with respect, here she was, sitting in custody because someone saw only what they wanted to see. She didn't want to feel bitter, but a dull ache settled in her chest. It wasn't just about her. It was about what it represented. Across the room, an officer walked past, glanced in, then stopped. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, as if recognizing something familiar. He frowned, then checked a file in his hand. Inside her mind, she replayed the entire event again. The store, the cashier, the guard, the moment she was stopped. She knew none of them were evil. They were just doing what they thought was right. But she also knew something deeper was wrong, a kind of silent bias that still ran deep, unnoticed, unspoken. Outside, the sky was turning orange. The evening sun slipped through the blinds, drawing faint lines across the walls. She sat quietly, waiting. After nearly an hour, the same officer who had arrested her returned. His voice was softer now. "We're just verifying a few things," he said, almost apologetic. She nodded once. "I understand," she replied. Her tone carried neither anger nor forgiveness, only calm certainty. He walked away quickly, looking unsettled. In that stillness, something inside her shifted. She had been through difficult moments before, but this one felt different. It wasn't physical, it was emotional. A kind of invisible bruise that came from being misunderstood, from being unseen for who she truly was. As the night began to settle, she heard distant laughter from the main hall. Officers talking, papers shuffling, phones ringing. Life went on as it always did, but soon everything in that station would change. Because the truth, her truth, was only moments away from being discovered. And when it was, it would shake every person in that room. For now, she sat quietly in that small waiting area, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above her, the cuff marks faint on her wrists, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She knew something they didn't know, something that would soon make them question everything they thought they understood about justice, perception, and trust. And when they finally learned who she really was, it wouldn't just clear her name. It would expose something much larger, something they could never again pretend not to see. The room was quiet except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The woman sat still on the cold bench, her hands resting loosely on her lap. Her eyes didn't wander much. She stared at the floor, lost in thought. Every few minutes, someone walked past the glass door, glancing at her with mild curiosity before looking away. She wasn't new to the inside of a police station. She had spent most of her adult life working in one. But sitting on the other side, feeling the weight of suspicion, the unspoken judgment, felt completely different. It was strange how familiar walls could suddenly feel foreign. Outside the small room, the officers talked among themselves. Their voices were low, filled with unease. The younger one, who had been the first to approach her at the store, seemed uncertain now. He kept looking at the computer screen, reading her details over and over. "Something's off," he finally said to his partner. "Her record's clean, but not just clean. Look at this section here. It says active service." His partner leaned over, frowning. "Active service? That can't be right. We picked her up for theft." The younger one scrolled down. "There's more," he said quietly. "It says she's with law enforcement. Rank captain." For a few seconds, silence hung heavy in the room. Both men looked at each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Wait," the older officer said slowly. "You mean we arrested a police captain?" "I think so," the younger one whispered. "She's a captain from another district. It's all here in the system." They stared at the screen again, rereading the details just to make sure it wasn't some kind of error. But there it was. Her name, her badge number, her years of service, even commendations for leadership and community work. The younger officer rubbed his forehead. "Oh man," he muttered under his breath. "What did we just do?" The other one didn't answer right away. He just stood there, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. Finally, he said, "We need to call the lieutenant now." Within minutes, the station's supervising officer walked in. He was tall, with a calm but serious expression. The younger officer quickly explained the situation, trying to keep his voice steady. The lieutenant listened carefully, glancing through the report. When he saw the woman's file, his eyes widened slightly. He looked through the window of the holding area and saw her sitting quietly, composed, her posture straight. "She's a captain?" he asked. "Yes, sir. From the West District. 20 years in service." The lieutenant let out a slow breath. "And you arrested her for shoplifting?" The younger one nodded, his face pale. "The store called it in. We thought—" The lieutenant raised a hand, stopping him. "Get her out of that room, now." They moved quickly. The door opened and the younger officer stepped in. "Ma'am," he said softly, his tone completely changed. "Would you please come with me?" She stood up slowly, not saying anything. Her expression didn't show surprise or relief, just quiet understanding. They guided her into a small office down the hall. The lieutenant stood there waiting. When she entered, he immediately removed his cap and said, "Captain, I'm deeply sorry about this. We just verified your credentials. There's been a terrible mistake." She nodded slightly, her eyes calm. "I figured you'd realize it eventually," she said. Her voice was steady, polite, but carried a weight that filled the room. The lieutenant looked embarrassed. "I can't imagine how humiliating this must have been for you. We'll take care of this right away." She took a slow breath, then looked directly at him. "What's done is done," she said. "But I want to know how it happened." He hesitated. "It seems the store staff thought you left without paying. They reported it. Our officers responded before checking the surveillance footage." "Did anyone check the footage now?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "You paid for everything." "The system just froze during the transaction." Her expression didn't change, but a flicker of sadness passed through her eyes. "So I was arrested because someone assumed." The lieutenant lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry, Captain." The younger officer, standing by the door, looked visibly ashamed. He wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She finally turned to him. "Officer," she said softly, "you were just doing your job. But next time, take a moment to listen before you act. It matters." He nodded quickly, his throat tightening. "Yes, ma'am." For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy with regret. Then the lieutenant cleared his throat. "We'll have your belongings returned right away. And of course the incident will be wiped from record." She looked around the small office. The same kind of space she had worked in for years, only now she was standing on the other side of it. It was a strange feeling to be both part of the system and a victim of it at the same time. She finally said, "I don't want anyone fired for this, but I do want a conversation with your team." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Of course. Whatever you request." When she left the office, every officer in the station seemed to pause. Conversations stopped. A few looked up from their desks, their expressions shifting as they realized who she was. She didn't meet their eyes. She simply walked past them, quiet and composed, carrying the same dignity she had walked in with. Outside, the air felt cool against her skin. The parking lot was nearly empty now. Her car sat where she had left it, the bag of items still in the back seat, untouched. She got in, shut the door, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something deeper, something quieter. A mix of disappointment and weariness. She had spent years trying to teach younger officers about fairness, about taking a moment to look beyond assumptions. And yet, even after all that, this had happened. As she drove home, she replayed every moment in her mind. The look on the employee's face, the tone of the officer's voice, the sting of the handcuffs. She knew none of them had meant real harm, but intent wasn't the same as impact. When she reached home, she didn't go inside right away. She sat in the car, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The city looked peaceful from the outside, but she knew how many unseen battles took place beneath its calm surface. Battles of perception, fear, and misunderstanding. She took out her phone and opened her messages. Dozens of missed calls and texts blinked on the screen. Colleagues, friends, her commanding officer from her own district. Word was spreading faster than she expected. Her phone rang again. She hesitated before answering. "Captain," came the voice on the other end. It was her chief. "I just heard what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said softly. "It was a mistake. It's been handled," he sighed heavily. "Handled or not, it never should have happened. We'll be contacting their department tomorrow. You shouldn't have gone through that." "I don't want to make it about me," she said. "But maybe it's a chance to start a bigger conversation." There was a pause. Then he said, "You're always thinking about the lesson before the wound heals." She gave a faint smile. "That's the only way I know how to move forward." After they hung up, she sat for a while longer staring at the night sky. A part of her wanted to forget the day completely, but another part of her knew she couldn't. Things like this didn't just disappear. They stayed, quietly reminding people of the work still left to do. The next morning, she woke early as she always did. Habit was something she relied on. Routine steadied her. She dressed in her uniform, the crisp shirt, the polished badge, the same badge that had once represented everything she believed in. When she looked in the mirror, she saw both strength and fatigue. But she also saw purpose. That afternoon, she drove to the other precinct, the one where the officers who had arrested her worked. The lieutenant was waiting when she arrived, looking nervous but respectful. "Captain," he greeted, "we weren't expecting you today." "I know," she said. "I came to talk." He led her inside. The officers who had been involved stood by the wall, uneasy and silent. She looked at each of them. No anger, no accusation, just quiet understanding. She began to speak, her voice calm but steady. "I've spent over 2 decades in this job. I've seen people make mistakes. But I've also seen what happens when we stop questioning why we do what we do." The room was completely still. Even those who hadn't been part of the arrest listened closely. "When you look at someone," she continued, "don't see a profile. Don't see a story you made up in your head. See a person. That's where justice starts." Her words hung in the air. The younger officer looked down, his face pale with regret. She took a breath. "We can't fix every mistake, but we can learn from them. And if we don't, then all the training in the world means nothing." When she finished, no one spoke. For a moment, the room felt heavy with reflection. Then the lieutenant said quietly, "Thank you, Captain." She nodded once. "Take care of your team," she said. Then she turned and walked out, her steps steady and sure. As she reached her car, she could feel eyes following her. Not out of suspicion this time, but out of respect. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something had shifted. Maybe not for everyone, but for some it had. And sometimes that was enough to start real change. The morning after her visit to the precinct felt strangely quiet. The sun was already up and the city had started its usual rush, but her home was still. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. She kept replaying everything that had happened. The look in the officers' eyes, the apology in their voices, and the weight that still lingered even after the truth came out. She didn't feel proud of how calm she had stayed. It wasn't strength, it was habit. Years in uniform had taught her to hold her composure even when everything inside her wanted to break. But now, in the stillness of her home, that calmness began to fade. The quiet made room for the ache she had been holding back. She took out her phone and scrolled through her messages. Dozens of them had come in overnight. Colleagues, friends, even reporters asking for her comment. She ignored most of them. She wasn't interested in fame or outrage. She didn't want her story to become another headline about the officer who was profiled. What she wanted was reflection, Real change, not noise. Her chief had called late last night and insisted on issuing a statement. She had asked him not to, but he said the public already knew. A witness video from the mall had gone viral overnight. The clip showed her being stopped, questioned, and handcuffed. Someone had captioned it, "Cops arrest woman for shoplifting. Turns out she's one of them." The comments under it were endless. Some people were furious at the officers. Others defended them, saying they were just doing their jobs. But what stood out most were the quiet voices, people who shared stories of being followed in stores, questioned for no reason or assumed guilty without a chance to speak. Reading through them, she felt a mix of sadness and hope. Sadness because so many had felt the same sting. Hope because maybe this time someone would listen. Later that day, her chief called again. "We've been contacted by the media," he said. "They want you to tell your side, but it's your call." She hesitated. "If I do," she said, "I want it to mean something. Not just about me." "Then say that," he told her gently. "Say it your way." That evening, she agreed to meet a local reporter at the station where she worked. The cameras were simple, the lights soft. When they started recording, she didn't read from notes or prepare a speech. She spoke plainly as if she were talking to a friend. "I wasn't angry," she said, looking into the camera. "I was disappointed. Not because I was arrested, but because I saw how easily assumptions replace understanding." She explained what had happened. The error at the checkout, the misunderstanding, the way the officers reacted. She didn't name anyone or blame the department. Instead, she talked about perception, about how quick judgments could hurt people, even when no one meant harm. The reporter asked her what she felt in that moment when she realized they didn't believe her. She paused for a long time before answering. "I felt invisible," she said quietly. "Not as a woman, not as an officer, just as a person. It's a feeling too many people know." The interview aired that night. It wasn't dramatic or sensational, but it spread fast. People admired her calmness, her honesty, her refusal to turn it into anger. For many, her story became more than an incident. It became a mirror. Within days, she began receiving invitations to speak at community meetings, police forums, and training seminars. Everyone wanted to hear how such a mistake could happen and how to prevent it. At first, she didn't want to go. The attention made her uncomfortable. But her chief encouraged her. "You've got their attention," he said. "Now use it." So she did. The first event was at a small police academy on the edge of town. The room was filled with young recruits, their uniforms crisp and their faces eager. She stood in front of them, not behind a podium, but right among the rows of chairs. "When I started out," she began, "I thought justice was about catching the bad guys. Over time, I learned it's also about protecting the good ones, from being wrongly judged, from being unseen." She told them her story, not to embarrass anyone, but to teach empathy. She spoke about how fear and bias often hide behind routine, how officers must learn to pause, to listen, to look deeper before they act. When she finished, the room was silent. Then slowly one recruit raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "how did you stay calm when they arrested you?" She smiled faintly. "Because I knew who I was," she replied, "even when they didn't." That answer stayed with many of them long after she left. Over the next few weeks, her story spread beyond the city. National outlets picked it up. She received messages from other officers, from civilians, from teachers and parents. Some thanked her for her grace. Others admitted they had once judged people too quickly. But not everyone was kind. Some accused her of exaggerating, of trying to make a name for herself. She read those comments too quietly, then let them go. She wasn't doing this for approval. She was doing it because silence had never fixed anything. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, she received an invitation from the same precinct where the arrest had happened. The lieutenant who had apologized to her called personally. "Captain," he said, his voice steady but nervous, "we've started a new training program. We'd be honored if you'd come and speak to our officers." She hesitated for a moment. Going back there would mean reliving that day all over again. But she could hear sincerity in his tone. He wasn't calling out of obligation. He was calling because he wanted to change things. "I'll come," she said finally, but not as a victim, as a teacher. When she arrived, the mood was very different from before. The officers who had once arrested her were there, sitting in the front row. Their faces were uneasy, but their eyes showed respect. The lieutenant introduced her softly, and she stepped forward. The room fell silent. She began by saying, "We all wear the same badge, but that badge doesn't make us perfect. It reminds us we have power, and with that comes responsibility." Then she told the story again, not as something to blame them for, but as something they could all learn from. She spoke about empathy, about slowing down, about treating every person with humanity first, not suspicion. At one point, her voice softened. "When you put those handcuffs on me, I didn't see two bad cops. I saw two people who forgot for a moment that justice begins with listening. That's what I want you to remember." The younger officer's eyes filled with tears. He looked down, unable to speak. After the session, he approached her quietly and said, "I'll remember that for the rest of my career." She placed a hand on his shoulder and said gently, "That's all I wanted." After that day, she drove home feeling lighter. The pain of what had happened hadn't disappeared, but something new had taken its place, a quiet sense of purpose. She realized that sometimes even painful experiences could plant seeds of change if handled with grace. But as the weeks passed, the story kept circulating. People continued to share the video online. It was still being discussed on talk shows, in classrooms, and in communities. The message had taken on a life of its own. One evening, while she was preparing dinner, her phone rang again. It was the reporter who had first interviewed her. "Captain," he said, "your story has started a citywide review of arrest procedures. They're implementing a new training program inspired by your message." She didn't know what to say for a moment. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Then it was worth it," she said softly. After hanging up, she looked out her kitchen window. The street outside was quiet, bathed in the orange light of sunset. For the first time since the arrest, she felt peace. Not because justice had been served, but because understanding had begun. That night, she sat on her porch, sipping tea, thinking about everything that had changed. The embarrassment, the humiliation, the regret, it all had led here. She realized that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that push people to grow the most. As the sky darkened, a soft breeze brushed her face. She thought about the two officers, their nervous voices, their apologies, the way they had listened in the end. She knew they would never forget that day. Neither would she. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is how change really begins." One story at a time, and somewhere not far away, two officers were sitting in their patrol car, talking quietly about her words, about what they had learned, about how they'd do things differently next time. They didn't know she was thinking of them, too. But maybe that connection, the silent understanding between people who had once stood on opposite sides, was the real victory after all. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, short clips of the arrest appeared on social media. The video showed the woman in handcuffs standing tall, her voice calm and her expression steady as the officers led her away. The caption underneath said, "Woman accused of shoplifting speaks like a cop." That one sentence was enough to stir curiosity. By the next morning, thousands of people had shared it. Comments poured in, some outraged, some confused, and some defending the officers. When the truth came out that the woman was actually a police captain, everything changed. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a shocking mistake. Reporters gathered outside the police department asking for statements. People online demanded answers. For the captain, it was overwhelming. She had never asked for attention, and now the whole country seemed to be watching her every move. Inside the station, things felt tense. Officers spoke in hushed tones when she passed by. Some looked embarrassed, others looked curious. The ones who had arrested her kept their distance, unable to face her eyes. It wasn't because she had shouted at them. She never did. It was because she had stayed calm, and that calmness had exposed the truth louder than anger ever could. She sat quietly in her office that morning, reading messages from people she'd never met. Some thanked her for her dignity. Others shared their own experiences of being unfairly judged. She read every word, her heart heavy but grateful. She never wanted to be seen as a victim. She wanted this to mean something. Later that day, her phone rang. It was the chief of police. He asked her to meet him in the main conference room. She hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked down the long hallway. The chief was already there, surrounded by senior officers. Cameras were set up outside. Reporters were waiting. When she entered, the room went silent. The chief spoke first. He admitted the department's mistake, calling it a failure to recognize one of our own, and a failure of judgment. Then he turned toward her and said, "We owe you an apology." She didn't want to make a scene. She just nodded politely and said, "I appreciate that, but I hope the apology doesn't stop here." Everyone turned to her. Her tone was steady, respectful, but full of weight. "This is not just about me," she continued. "It's about every person who gets treated unfairly because of how they look or where they come from. We wear this uniform to protect, not to assume. We can do better." Her words hit hard. Even the officers who weren't directly involved felt something shift inside them. She wasn't blaming anyone personally. She was calling for change. That evening, when the department held a press conference, she stood beside the chief. Cameras flashed as reporters asked questions. One of them asked her how she felt when she was handcuffed. She paused, then said softly, "It wasn't the cuffs that hurt. It was realizing that even after years in this uniform, some people still saw me as something I'm not." That single line was replayed on television and across social media for days. People quoted her words in articles and discussion panels. She became a quiet symbol of strength, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. In the days that followed, she received invitations from news shows and podcasts. She turned most of them down. She didn't want fame. She wanted progress. But one day, she accepted an invitation to speak at a community meeting where police and local residents gathered to rebuild trust. When she arrived, the room was full. People clapped as she walked in, though she didn't expect it. She smiled slightly and thanked them. Then she took the microphone and began speaking. "I didn't come here to talk about myself," she said. "I came because I love this job and I love this community. But loving something means you want it to be better." She spoke about what it felt like to be judged unfairly, not as a captain, but as a person. She reminded everyone that behind every uniform and every badge there should be empathy. She talked about listening before assuming, about treating people as individuals instead of stereotypes. As she spoke, some officers lowered their heads, thinking about their own actions. Community members nodded, feeling seen and understood. By the time she finished, there were quiet tears in the room. Outside, a group of young people waited to meet her. One of them, a teenage girl, said softly, "I saw your video. You made me believe that maybe things can change." The captain smiled and told her, "They can if people like you keep believing." But not everyone reacted kindly. Some people online accused her of using the situation for attention. Others said she was too soft on the officers. She read those comments late at night, sitting alone in her living room. They stung, but she refused to respond with anger. She knew real change didn't come from shouting back. It came from showing what was right, even when no one was watching. A few days later, the department organized a training session on bias awareness and community respect. It was mandatory for all officers. The captain was asked to lead part of it. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want it to seem like revenge or punishment. But then she realized it was an opportunity to help others see what she had seen. When she entered the training room, the same officers who had once arrested her were there. They looked uneasy, unsure of how to act. She greeted them politely as if nothing had happened. Then she began speaking. "I know this is uncomfortable," she said, "but growth usually is. I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else." She played clips of real situations where bias had affected decisions, not just about race, but about age, gender, and appearance. She explained how quick judgments could destroy trust between police and the people they served. Halfway through, she paused and looked at the room. "The hardest part of my experience wasn't the handcuffs," she said quietly. "It was realizing that we, as officers, sometimes forget to look at the whole person. That's what we have to fix, not just for the community, but for ourselves." When the session ended, several officers stayed behind. One approached her nervously. "Ma'am," he said, "I was one of the officers that day. I just want to say I'm sorry. I didn't see you, not really. I saw what I expected to see." She looked at him kindly and replied, "Thank you for saying that. What matters now is what you'll do next time." He nodded, eyes wet, and walked away. She knew that moment meant something. Maybe small, but real. Over the next few weeks, her story continued to spread, but now people focused less on the arrest and more on the message. Articles described her as the captain who turned pain into purpose. Her calm strength became an example in police ethics classes and leadership workshops. She received letters from people around the country, teachers, students, even retired officers, thanking her for her grace. One letter from a young recruit stood out. It said, "I joined the force because I saw your story. I want to do it right." Reading that, she smiled for the first time in days. It reminded her why she had joined the force years ago. Not for power or recognition, but to protect and guide others. But even with all the positive attention, she stayed humble. When reporters asked what she wanted people to remember, she said, "Not my name. Remember the lesson. Remember to look twice before you judge." Her department began new training programs based on what she had taught. The chief publicly credited her for inspiring the change. Other police departments in nearby cities reached out for help creating similar sessions. Slowly, the ripple of her experience spread beyond her city. One night, as she walked out of the station, she saw a group of young officers chatting near their patrol car. They stopped when they saw her, then nodded respectfully. She nodded back and smiled faintly. That small gesture meant more than words. As she drove home, she thought about how one terrible misunderstanding had turned into something powerful. It didn't erase what happened, but it gave it meaning. The world hadn't changed overnight, but maybe it had taken a small step in the right direction. When she got home, she sat on her porch, listening to the quiet city sounds. The same city that had once watched her being handcuffed was now listening to her speak about compassion and reform. Life had a strange way of turning pain into purpose, and as she looked at the stars above, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do all along. Not just lead with a badge, but with heart." Months passed, and the world slowly moved on to new headlines, new stories. But inside the department, something had changed for good. The incident that had once been a painful memory had turned into a spark that lit a quiet movement for understanding and reform. Officers were speaking differently now. They questioned their own instincts more often. They listened more, and they treated people with more patience. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The captain, though, stayed focused on her work. She never wanted the story to be about her. She wanted it to be about growth. She continued leading her team, running training sessions and mentoring new recruits. People respected her more than ever, not because of her rank, but because of how she handled herself when life tested her the most. One morning, the department organized a large seminar for officers from different districts. It was called Human Before Uniform. The event was meant to remind officers of the reason they joined the force in the first place, to serve people, not judge them. The captain was asked to be the closing speaker. At first, she hesitated. Standing in front of hundreds of officers wasn't easy, especially after what had happened. But she agreed, not for herself, but for the message she believed needed to be heard. The day of the seminar arrived. The hall was filled with rows of officers, some young, some old, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. The air was serious but expectant. The walls were lined with banners carrying words like integrity, respect, and compassion. As the captain waited backstage, she took a deep breath. She looked at the faces in the crowd through the curtain. Many of them reminded her of herself when she first joined, full of hope, courage, and the belief that they could make a difference. But she also knew how easy it was to lose that sense of humanity after years of seeing the darker side of life. When her name was called, the room filled with applause. She walked to the stage with calm steps, wearing her uniform neatly pressed. Her presence carried quiet authority. The applause faded, and she began speaking in her usual steady tone. "Every person in this room took an oath," she said, "an oath to serve and protect. But sometimes in the middle of that duty, we forget what those words truly mean." She paused for a moment and looked around. The room was silent. "I know what it feels like to wear this badge with pride," she continued. "And I also know what it feels like to have that badge not protect you when it should. I learned that even good officers can make mistakes, not out of hatred, but out of assumption." She spoke simply without anger or blame. Her words were gentle but firm. She told them how it felt to be handcuffed, not as a criminal, but as someone who had given her life to the same system that failed her for a moment. She spoke about how easy it was to fall into quick judgments, how a single decision could change someone's entire life.